Chapter 11. In the spring of 1993, my grad school practicum assignment was to work as a school counselor trainee at 3 mainstream schools in Rockville, Maryland. It was my first exposure to the world of mainstreaming under the perspective of soon-to-be deaf professional. My only experience in deaf education at that point in time involved being a solitary mainstream student at GFS and a dorm supervisor at PSD. I had also for a short time observed some classes at Kendall Demonstration Elementary School and Model Secondary School for the Deaf, which are situated on Gallaudet Kendall Green campus. Prior to beginning my practicum assignment, I was permitted to observe a few classes on site. It was interesting to be in the mainstream environment of which the deaf community had mixed feelings. Before I got to see for myself, the only things I had heard about mainstream programs were some less than favorable comments. First, they do not offer an environment conducive to overall personal growth. Lack of social capital adversely affects deaf students' social and emotional development. Second, students have to deal with the ignorance and discrimination from hearing staff and peers who don't know much, if anything, about deaf identity. Third, due to the aforementioned limitations, students do not have the opportunity to develop leadership skills the way that they do at deaf schools. It is harder to be a leader when you're isolated. Fourth, misinterpretation of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, and least restrictive environment results in many excellent deaf students not being given the chance to attend deaf schools. Consequently, deaf schools suffer declining enrollment and miss out on students who would have been excellent peers and role models. Fifth, many deaf schools wind up being treated as dumping grounds by their school districts. Deaf students are often referred to a deaf school only after they've failed in mainstream. They arrive at the respective deaf schools with significant language delays. The staff at deaf schools have to work extra hard to fill in the gaps. It's one thing to hear about the controversial issues regarding education in mainstream. It's another to understand them. It was with much curiosity that I observed a few classes at Barnsley Elementary School, Wood Middle School, and Rockville High School. I walked into those schools with a blank slate, a naive blank slate. Some of the mainstream students attended regular classes with an interpreter, while others attended special classes that were for deaf students only. A small number of students had the option of doing both, depending on their individual needs. The first class I got to observe was a group of 12 or 13 students at Wood Middle School. I was in for a surprise. They were going over their reading assignment, the story of Aesop's Fables. I smiled as I recalled my late grandfather, who had also read those stories with me when I was younger. That's when the realization hit me. Hey, these kids are actually reading material that they're supposed to read. I was dumbfounded. In deaf residential schools, it was all too common to see students struggling to read material that was far below what they considered age appropriate. Yet these mainstream kids were reading the same material as their hearing peers. Inevitably, I began to question the quality of education in deaf residential schools. I recalled the time that I wasn't permitted to transfer to a deaf school as an 8th grader because I had already exceeded the academic level of their high school curriculum. How could this be permitted to happen? My wide-eyed observations continued at a nearby Rockville High School, where I observed a group of deaf students discussing in-depth material related to the Civil War. Unbelievable, I thought. It was obvious that mainstream programs in Rockville blew away any deaf school as far as academics were concerned. Socially, the deaf kids did seem to be somewhat at a disadvantage compared to the students at a residential school. Their interactions was limited with mostly socializing amongst each other as opposed to overall and much larger student population. They didn't seem to interact with much of the other hearing students, although there was a large number of hearing students taking ASL class at Rockville High School. Regardless of the relatively limited social environment, this was still the heck of a lot better than being the only deaf kid in school, as I had been at GFS. Granted, maybe there weren't as many opportunities where the kids could develop deeper social and leadership skills. Maybe there was always a gnawing feeling that perhaps they didn't measure up to the hearing kids, who were more likely to make the football team or become class president. I struggled with this and other pros and cons. Perhaps any social ramifications were negligible, as the kids could later catch up in an environment such as Gallaudet University or any local deaf club they could join as adults. Besides, we had counseling groups that discussed what it was like to be deaf in the hearing world. Most of the students, at least the ones I worked with, seemed to have a healthy, realistic attitudes about themselves. Note, that was just me trying to be positive at the time. Emerging research and my own evolving a real life opinion would later indicate that social capital is just as important as access to language and education. Social capital could not be reviewed as something to catch up on later. By the end of my first week working in 3 mainstream schools, I vented my frustrations about deaf education to Melanie. Mel, I began, for all of my years at Gallaudet, I have been pro-deaf culture. You know how I didn't really learn anything about myself until I came to Gallaudet. You've seen me insist that the best classes for deaf kids are the ones in deaf schools, where ASL is the language of choice. So why are the mainstream kids kicking their butts? Those kids at Rockville are so far ahead of deaf kids in residential schools, and their English skills are much better. Much better. What's wrong with residential schools? Melody smiled and shook her head. She happened to be majoring in deaf education at the time, so she had the resources to answer my questions and concerns. She sighed and then reached for an educational handout she had stored away in her files. She handed it to me and told me to read it very carefully. I leafed through the handout and let out a long, "Oh." It contained the findings of extensive study which revealed that most prelingually deaf children tend to have the same reading and writing levels regardless whether they were in residential or mainstream school. Oops. In the midst of all the academic achievement going on at mainstream schools, I overlooked that factor. I realized that most of the students who had blown me away with their excellent reading and writing skills were in the exact same boat that I was many years before. Many of them had significant amount of residual hearing and speech ability, which helped them pick up language during their crucial formative years. Thus, they were not too far behind their hearing peers, and if they were behind at all. But what about, I mentioned, a prelingually deaf student at Rockville who had exhibited superior academic skills. Are her parents deaf? Melanie asked. I smiled. Indeed, they were. Melanie then asked me to name a few prelingually deaf students at Gallaudet who had gone to residential schools and were from deaf families. I began to name a few. Among them were Kelby Brick, Larry's son who graduated from MSSD, then Gallaudet, had gone on to law school, and in fact, all of the people I came up with were either in grad school or already holding good jobs. The dim light bulb in my head finally clicked on. It took a while, but Mel effectively made her point. Upon taking a closer look, I realized that there were some prelingually deaf kids in mainstream programs who did not come from families that use sign language. Predictably, they were significantly behind everyone else. So there you have it, folks. Language acquisition is critical. It has to happen. If you don't acquire language, any language, including ASL, during your first few years on this planet, you're going to be delayed. So which is better, mainstreaming or deaf schools? It is hard to answer that question because there isn't a level playing field. It depends entirely upon where you live. There are mainstream programs that have accessibility galore thanks to the high level of deaf awareness. There are mainstream programs that are totally ignorant and make you want to bang your head against a wall. There are deaf schools that leave you puzzled because you assume their teachers would be fluent in ASL, and they're not. There are deaf schools that have all of the ingredients to be wildly successful, but school districts will hamper that by funneling deaf schools into mainstream. Then there are select deaf schools that are so powerful, so effective, that parents in the know will relocate cross-country if they have to enroll their children at these schools. You have to really do your homework before enrolling your deaf kid into any school. Once again, the bottom line, a deaf child's access to language or lack thereof during critical years from birth to age 5. If this child is hard of hearing with a significant hearing and speech ability, he or she might establish enough of a language base and consequent cognitive development to be close or equal to his or her hearing peers. If a child is prelingually deaf, it is crucial that he or she is consistently exposed to ASL for a maximum access to the language. The formula is simple. No language equals no learning. If there is neither language nor learning in this first 5 years of life, a child will spend the rest of his or her academic years at a significant disadvantage. It needs to be emphasized that there is a lot more than just learning going on when you have access to language between birth and the age of 5. There is actual brain growth and development taking place. Let me put it in a way. Language and access to it, regardless of whether it's spoken or signed, is brain food. This is the reason why many prelingually deaf adults today can only read at a 3rd or 4th grade level. I cannot emphasize this enough. If a child is prelingually deaf, exposure to ASL is the opportunity to use, and the opportunity to use it is extremely important. Only the parents can see to it that this is accomplished. A sobering fact: at a recent workshop, it was said that of virtually all children, 92% of learning occurs at the home. There is only so much a school can do to bring that child up to par if it isn't happening at home. And there's often a language delay at home, too. Unfortunately, parents are not sufficiently informed about what they can do to maximize language acquisition for their deaf children. They are often told about hearing aids, cochlear implants, but not ASL. Many, unfortunately, are even discouraged from using ASL. This sad reality is that many deaf children come from homes where no one uses sign language. Note, in earlier editions of this book, I always emphasize that prelingually deaf children need ASL to fill in the gaps. It turns out it's bigger than that. Current research now indicates that all children, even hearing children, gain immense benefit from ASL. This also applies to deaf and hard of hearing children who have cochlear implants. This practicum experience was an eye-opener for me. If you built a time machine and went back to find me in 1993, I would not be able to explain all of this to you. Eventually, I finished grad school and earned a master's degree in 1994, and still wouldn't have been able to explain anything. It would take several more years before everything else made sense. There are just so many complex factors that affect deaf education. There's no one simple answer for everything, but rather a series of things that must come together synergistically. If you asked me today, I would steer you towards a fantastic book titled Turning the Tide, Making Life Better for Deaf and Hard of Hearing School Children by Dr. Gina Olivia and Dr. Linda Lytle. If you want to put all of the pieces together, that is a great place to start.
Chapter 12. During the summer of 1994, Melanie and I flew up to her hometown of Fort St. John, British Columbia, for our wedding. Melanie's mother, Margaret, had already handled most of the dirty work by the time we arrived. She did a fantastic job seeing to it that everything was taken care of, and she made sure that all visitors, including my family, were comfortable and enjoying themselves. Melanie's sister Shauna also did her share of work and then some. In addition to assisting with all of the planning and coordinating, she graciously agreed to do a 12-hour road trip drive to Edmonton, where she would pick up my friends and groomsmen, Jeff Jones and Tony Peeler. Shauna also had to deal with getting busted by the Canadian police. She drove a rental car, was registered in my name only, and as Murphy's Law would have it, the police had a random check stop on the highway. Shauna and her bemused passengers were stuck for hours in the middle of Canadian nowhere. It took quite a while to get out of that mess. Yes, Melanie and I had to drive down there and bail them out. It turned out to be a fun diversion from all of the wedding jitters anyway. The movies Road Trip and Euro Trip were probably inspired by our misadventures. Canadian Trip, anyone? By the time we got back to St. Fort John, it was 6 a.m, but it didn't dampen our spirits at all. We started our pre-wedding party right then and there. Other relatives and guests woke up, surprised to find us indulging in all of the party food and beverages you'd expect in the evening hours. A few of them even joined us, passing up the traditional bacon and eggs for pizza and beer. Hey, Shauna, we love ya. Meanwhile, Melanie's father, Bob, had also added some unique touches of his own to the wedding. Being a collector of antique automobiles, he prepped up two of them for a wedding procession, a 1964 Studebaker convertible and a 1965 Chevy Supersport. Melanie and I were going to get hitched in style, no doubt about it. It was a great change of pace to be in St. Fort John after all of the craziness back in the States. Fort St. John happened to be on mile 42 of the Alaska Highway, so you can hardly get any further away than that. Whether it was sitting out back enjoying the clear night sky and the northern lights or relaxing indoors with Melanie's family, I was getting a much-needed break from the hassles back home. I'm telling you, it's no surprise that we never see Canada in the news that much back in the States. We see so much coverage about war, disaster, and political struggles in other countries, but rarely do we hear about Canada, our quiet and friendly neighbor. They're too busy being real, genuine people up there. In Fort St. John, people smile, say hello, and can leave their car running while they go into the convenience store to buy a newspaper. Try that in New York, huh? On July 16th, Melanie and I had a beautiful wedding at St. Luke's United Church. At first, I was nervous because some of my own relatives had expressed concern that the wedding was in a church. We actually took steps to make sure the minister wouldn't say anything that might be deemed offensive by those of different faith. Looking back, I'm probably the moron who invented political correctness. See how out of control it is now? My fault. Since I have absolutely no religious preference of my own, I wouldn't have cared if it was a Mooney wedding at the airport. But for a moment there, I was worried that someone might speak up during the infamous, "If anyone should have any reason why these two people should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace" window of opportunity that always comes up at weddings. Who's the wise guy who came up with that idea in the first place? What kind of nitwit would actually want to introduce the idea of protest at a wedding? If you had any objections, wouldn't it make more sense to speak up before the wedding, thus saving everyone the hassle of planning, traveling, dressing up, buying gifts, and then having everything fall apart the last second? I swear, whoever put that scary line in there prior to "I do" must have been a drama queen. Truth be told, I really was nervous because of the objections some of my family brought up due to their religious convictions. There was indeed some behind-the-scenes drama, and we maneuvered through it as tactfully as we could. I'm not going to relive it here, but if Melanie and I were ever decide to renew our vows, my mind is made up. We're going to do it at the Elvis Drive-Thru Chapel in Las Vegas. I mean it. Fortunately, and to the delight of everyone, the wedding was absolutely beautiful. The only suspense came from Melanie's 7-year-old nephew, Donovan, who wasn't too comfortable with the idea of being a ring bearer. His quick-thinking mother bribed him with a Lego set, and he kept his end of the deal. He performed his duty as a ring bearer perfectly, and he was very patient during the long photo session afterward. I made a mental note that next time my family objected to anything I did, I would buy them a Lego set. Seriously, the whole thing went perfectly, bordering on surreal. Melanie looked positively radiant, and I was in a daze. As Melanie and I exchanged our vows, both families beamed with pride and joy. I kicked myself for worrying that my family would object enough to interrupt anything. Sure, we had our differences of opinion, but above all, we loved each other immensely. I noticed my grandmother Rose, grinning from ear to ear. She was genuinely happy for me and had conducted herself with great dignity. She had, in fact, shown beyond a doubt that her love was unconditional. In the past, I had, for whatever reason, felt that I always needed to win her approval, to be hearing, to be this, to be that. Today, she had effectively shown that she loved me no matter what. I had not only gained a wonderful wife, but also a more genuine love and respect for my family. After the wedding and a great vacation in Vancouver, it was time to come back to Earth. Melanie and I returned to Maryland, where a number of changes awaited us. There was, however, one particularly frustrating problem. I couldn't find a job anywhere. During my time in Canada, I had looked into any possible school counseling positions, but there were none. Networking is everything, and in Canada, I hadn't networked with anyone except the nice RCMP officers who almost seized my rental car. Back east in Maryland, I had certainly made a name for myself, but so had thousands of other deaf people because of the close proximity to Gallaudet University. There's no shortage of deaf people with advanced degrees in Maryland. The competition for jobs in Maryland's deaf community is therefore extremely tough. In Pennsylvania, there were 2 openings, but they were for a coordinator and a case manager at a mental health center. Not exactly what I had studied for, although I still threw my hat into the ring. Again, no luck. Before I threw in the towel, there was an ironic twist of fate. A very good friend of mine, Michael Ralph, left his job as school psychologist at PSD to accept a similar position elsewhere. This meant that there was an opening in the Evaluation, Enrollment, and Counseling Center at PSD, and it wasn't long before they contacted me. Although I'm a school counselor, not a school psychologist, PSD still decided to hire me. They had one other school psychologist and also another school counselor, but that counselor would be going on maternity leave the following year. Throughout all of this shuffling, they had decided to hire another school counselor, which turned out to be me. I would provide individual and group counseling services, crisis intervention, case management, and occasionally assist in procedures related to enrolling new students. Again, PSD was going to play a major part in my life. It was an eye-opening homecoming. Although there was a myriad of topics covered in both individual and group counseling, one thing that struck me quite hard was the prevalence of family issues, particularly those related to communication barriers. I realized right away that I've been very fortunate to have deaf parents and a deaf wife who understand firsthand what it means to be deaf. Most deaf children are the only deaf person in their family, and while I've had my share of frustrations with hearing relatives, there have always been deaf family members and friends with whom I could find a healthy balance. For deaf children who do not have this luxury, I had not realized how isolating this can be. This soon became evident during the winter holiday season when PSD had a 12-day break. While numerous staff and students had broad smiles on their faces as they eagerly anticipated their vacation, there was one young girl who caught my attention with an entirely different attitude. As 14-year-old Lori passed me in the hallway, I wished her happy holiday and told her to enjoy her break. "Oh, boring," she shot back. "I don't want to stay home for 12 days. "Really?" I asked. "Aren't you glad to get a break from all the hard work you've done?" "Yeah, but at home it's boring." "Why do you say that?" "No one in my family can sign. Stupid family, boring." That explained it. I should have known. In the midst of all the holiday cheer, in my own excitement to escape the blahs of the rat race, I'd completely forgotten that for some people the holidays can be quite frustrating. Lori was going to be twiddling her thumbs for 12 days. I could not imagine how hard it must be for her. Lucky me, I get to go home to my deaf wife and we can visit our deaf friends or our deaf relatives anytime. As for the hearing relatives on my mother's side of the family, it's not that bad. There are usually more than 2 deaf people present who can keep each other company when that part of the family has an event. Besides, should it get too boring, Melanie and I are grown adults who can get up and leave whenever we want. Lori, on the other hand, had none of the above, no such freedom. Asked to explain how that felt, she put her index finger between her lips and twiddled it up and down. Boo. That pretty much said it all. After the break was over, Lori was thrilled to be back in school. So were a significant number of classmates. I decided to ask them how their vacations had gone. Most of them said it was all right, and they shared stories of eating delicious food and getting new toys for Christmas. Lori mentioned that she enjoyed the holiday food and gifts as well, but she also felt left out when she had to sit silently at the table as her hearing family chatted nonstop. I smiled and remarked that this was a common phenomenon known as the dinner table syndrome. I asked the class how many of them had ever had to sit and just smile politely at a family gathering where they were oblivious to all the conversations going on around them. Every single hand in the classroom went up. Lori's eyes widened in surprise as she realized that her problem was not unusual for most deaf people. "I sit there like a statue," said one student. "I ask my mom what people say, but she says, 'Never mind,' or 'It's not important,'" said another. "My mom signs, but no one else in the family does. I can talk to my deaf brother, but that's it. I want to watch TV, but mom yells at me if I leave the table. I can lip read, but only one person at a time. and so on and so on. Every student had a story about how he or she tolerated the dinner table syndrome. Lori was not alone. Now that we had all identified the problem, it was time to look for a solution. So, what could we do? The class came up with the following possibilities. Encourage your family to learn sign language. Negotiate. Tell your parents it's not fair to be expected to sit for an extended period of time with hearing people who don't sign. Get permission to excuse yourself so that you can go play a game, read a book, or watch TV. Invite a deaf friend or relative over so you have someone to talk to. For really big special events, ask for an interpreter. During a long vacation, arrange to visit deaf friends and classmates as much as possible. These are all excellent ideas that I definitely support, as usual. The students had shown their insights and creativity in such a way that it was I who learned from them instead of the other way around. They were absolutely right. With a little awareness and sensitivity, we can form a reasonable bridge between the deaf and hearing worlds. I knew I was going to enjoy working with them. I also knew that I was working with the kind of staff that you get to collaborate with once in a lifetime. My immediate supervisor, Lisa Stanteman-Hellberg, has this remarkable therapeutic gift of being able to get other people to see themselves in a different light. One of my rookie mistakes as a counselor at PSD was trying to fix everything for everyone. Lisa taught me to instead guide the kids in such a manner that they could figure out for their own game plan to reach their goals. Lisa also highly values the team approach, and thanks to her philosophy, we've had the opportunity to collaborate with some very gifted professionals. One of them, Sam Scott, is a dynamic family counselor who adds new meaning to the phrase "think outside the box." Sam is the kind of counselor who will get right to the root of the issue through the most creative strategies. For example, there was this one time Sam intentionally got into an argument with me in front of two eternally bickering students. As we yammered back and forth, we had the two students' undivided attention. Then, at the drop of a hat, we abruptly got up and left. The two students actually followed us out the door to see if we were okay. Together, they weren't arguing anymore. They got along fine the rest of the day. As some other staff wondered just what in the world Sam was doing, and it worked. Sam calmly replied, "They had our attention. It was our job to get their attention." This is the kind of guy I really enjoyed working with. There have also been situations that went far beyond the scope of a school counselor's ability. It's an unfortunate reality that when deaf students face significant mental health issues, such as childhood trauma, maladjusted behavior, sexual and physical abuse, and other issues of a more clinical nature, it's difficult to obtain accessible mental health services in a quick, timely manner. There are also situations where a particular student probably shouldn't be enrolled at a regular deaf school due to significant clinical issues, but there just isn't any other place they can go. They're considered deaf first, everything else second. I'm not saying this is right or wrong, it just is. On the one hand, it gets overwhelming at times. On the other hand, we've had success stories that you absolutely wouldn't believe if you didn't see it for yourself. And these are success stories with kids that no one else could handle. I don't think the outside world gives PSD enough credit for this, just my honest opinion. When I first started working at PSD, it was not uncommon for counselors to refer out the tougher clinical cases only to have them bounce right back. There simply weren't any mental health agencies that could provide a signing therapist or a competent interpreter. The Americans with Disabilities Act was still in its early stages, and it was a slow, gradual process before things got better. During this challenging time, Lisa made sure we had top-notch clinical therapists such as Cass Livensboss, Dr. Ann Steinberg, Dr. Jeff Nasser, available for supervision and support. I cannot tell you enough how much it meant to us to have these professionals working with us and mentoring us until mental health services for the deaf in Philadelphia became accessible enough for us to refer out our most challenging cases. Thanks to the improved access in our community, we've been able to focus on more guidance counseling related topics such as social skills, problem solving skills, study skills, sex education, drug, alcohol awareness, and preparing for the future, be it applying to college or finding a vocation. Services are now more streamlined, and every student at PSD gets access to a counselor offering proactive guidance as opposed to the old model where a small number of clinical cases took up most of the counselor's time. I also feel compelled to add that the restoration of the high school program had a tremendous impact. I can't imagine all of the political and red tape that Headmaster Joe Finkgrund had to maneuver through in order to make this happen. I've heard rumors that he faced opposition when he did this, but I don't have any juicy details. I'm just glad he got it done. You can see the difference in the students' attitudes all the way from preschool and up. After the high school was reinstated, there were, of course, some growing pains, but once everything was in place, and especially after the first high school graduation at Germantown campus, all of the students seemed to gain a greater sense of purpose. Seeing PSD students going through a college admission process, finding jobs through the World of Work program, and then graduating and coming back to visit with a ton of stories, it had an incredible ripple effect. It's not unusual for a middle school student to approach me and ask how a student who graduated 2 or 3 years ago is doing. He's still at Gallaudet? Great. When younger students can see the end result of the work they're being asked to do now, they can take it more seriously. I'm so glad the high school is back.